Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this EBA organized workshop with a somewhat daunting title of Credible Explanations of Development Outcomes, Improving Quality and Rigor with Bayesian Theory-Based Evaluation. My name is Kim Fors, and I'm one of the members of the EBA committee. Just a few words about EBA, the Expert Group for AIDS Studies. We are a government-appointed committee. We were set up almost 9 years ago, and we are both 10 persons in the committee appointed by the government, and then we have a secretariat who help us to commission and undertake, implement, and finally disseminate evaluations and other studies. Done for the sake of improving and knowing about the impact and the effects of Swedish development cooperation. Today's workshop, we have a pleasure of launching a new report with a title here, Credible Explanations of Development Outcomes. It will be presented by Barbara Befani, who will be with us on a film, and then afterwards in live on a link to respond to questions and engage in discussions with us. We have a few phases to the discussions this afternoon. First, there is the general presentation by Barbara of her report. Then we have a guest here who will take part in discussing the report, and then we will go more into depth in it together with Barbara successively during the afternoon. But let me try to be short here and go straight to introducing Barbara Befani to you. Barbara is well known for most people who have been reading on evaluation methodology. She has been, if not dominating, then certainly a very important participant in the methodological discussions in the evaluation community, both here in Sweden. She has been doing our studies for us at EBA, and she has been participating in the Swedish Evaluation Society's annual meetings, and of course the annual meetings of other evaluation societies abroad. She is a visiting fellow at the University of Surrey, and well, by and large, she is known as a very innovative, profound thinker and methodologically very rigorous evaluator who has a lot to teach us all. And we look forward to having your presentation of this study of yours, Barbara. So over to you now, and you're very welcome here.
Hello, welcome to this pre-recorded presentation about the report. The title is Credible Explanation of Development Outcomes, Improving Quality and Rigor with Bayesian Theory-Based Evaluation. So I will start by briefly mentioning quality in evaluation / evaluation research, because there are some overlaps, and why this is relevant for the method that I will be presenting. The definition of method that I will use here is different from the definition of the World Bank sourcebook that I presented earlier today. So I use method in a similar way as we use approach in the other book, and what is defined as method in the other book here is defined as data collection technique, sort of directly. So the word method is a bit broader and higher level, if you want. Then I will move on to typical weaknesses of theory-based evaluation and also typical cognitive biases. And then I will define Bayesian theory-based evaluation, which I also like very much to call diagnostic theory-based evaluation, because Bayesian sometimes evokes like numerical operations and numerical calculations, but they are not necessarily front and center here. So there's also a sort of qualitative way of doing this, of applying this method. And then I will say, I will focus quite a bit on how Bayesian theory-based evaluation or diagnostic theory-based evaluation differs from typical theory-based evaluation, traditional TB, if you want. We will focus on the 3 building blocks of TB, of Bayesian TB. And we will have to cover the Bayes formula. Perhaps not everyone will be enthusiastic about this, but it's very central to the conceptual framework of the method. Finally, we will see how this can be applied using qualitative descriptors and qualitative concepts without necessarily handling numbers. And we will see what's the relation with process tracing categorical tests. Finally, we will mention the application steps and see how this is done more in practice. But yes, most of the this introduction I would say won't be highly practical. It's more about the theoretical foundations of the method, which are extremely important to understand it, especially because these are usually not covered in like traditional university courses. And it's something that people usually have to learn later on in life. Okay, moving on. I've been doing some work on quality dimensions in evaluation and as well in research. And we came up with, well, essentially it was mostly me. So let's say I came up with these 8 dimensions. So I'm not spending a lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea: conceptual framing, transparency, also known as repeatability and replicability, methodological appropriateness, validity. By this here, we mean construct validity, credibility, which we also call internal validity or truth value of the findings, transferability, which is linked to external validity, and finally reliability, which has the most synonyms. Like it can also be called robustness, consistency, and dependability. Finally, coherence and structure of the report. So I highlighted transparency, credibility, and reliability because these are some of the main weaknesses of traditional theory-based evaluation. And it's something that the Bayesian approach or the diagnostic approach can help with. So what are the typical weaknesses of theory-based evaluation? Well, mostly there's a loose connection between theories and data analysis, and obviously data collection too. So most theory-based evaluation approaches focus on the form that the theory takes. So for example, you have contribution analysis, which sort of looks like this. It's like a sequence, a chain of intermediate outcomes, results, or you have realist evaluation, which has CMO configuration. You have systems-based approaches, which have more complicated visualizations. But essentially, none of these approaches focus on why we should believe that the theory holds, that the theory is true, and how it links to empirical data. I mean, there is some link, but yeah, as I will say later, it's not very satisfactory. So I will say why this creates problem with the 3 quality criteria that I mentioned, and also which cognitive biases this creates problem with. So at least 2 cognitive biases are not treated explicitly by typical theory-based evaluation. So they are conservatism, which is linked to the anchoring bias, and confirmation bias. So I'll give you an example of this loose connection between theory and data. So when you read most of this evaluation, the claims in the findings are essentially preceded or followed by the data collection and data analysis techniques that have been used. So they're like, these are our findings, and this has been our methodology. This is the data collection analysis that we use, and that's it. But using those techniques in itself, which mostly they are techniques, they're not even methods at a sort of higher level that is intended here. So using those in itself does not guarantee that the findings are valid. So there is no explicit assessment of the value of the empirical observation, of the probative value, of the strength of the evidence. And there is no formal assessment of the level of confidence that we have on the theory, on the findings, after having observed the evidence. So there is a gap. It's difficult to reconstruct the mental process intercurring between observation and theorization or theory refinement. And this leads to low transparency and low repeatability, and therefore low reliability of the findings. And the fact that there's no formal assessment of the level of confidence harms credibility. For example, in statistical analysis, results always come with a p-value, with a confidence intervals, and so on. So what is the conservatism? So anchoring is basically, the anchoring bias is the idea that belief formation is influenced by a particular reference point or anchor. And the value of the anchor is set. So subsequent arguments, estimates, belief change, but they don't change enough. So they still remain anchored to the initial point. And in particular, conservatism is the tendency to revise one beliefs insufficiently when presented with new evidence. So we do revise our beliefs, but insufficiently, and we remain anchored to our prior belief or level of confidence. The good news is that using the Bayes formula completely removes this kind of bias. There's been an experiment on conservatism, but I think I don't have time to go through this. We can deal with this in the Q&A if you want. So let's deal with confirmation bias. There are three types of confirmation bias: search confirmation bias, interpretation, and memory recall. So what does this consist of? Search confirmation bias is something that happens when we search information. So we sort of naturally gravitate towards information that strengthens our preferred theory at the expense of completeness and a broad overview of all the information that's out there. We sort of naturally gravitate towards what confirms our beliefs. Interpretation confirmation bias is when we have neutral information or ambiguous information, and then we interpret that as strengthening our preferred theory. And someone with the opposite bias will say that, no, it actually strengthens their theory, and so on. Memory recall is the tendency to remove or block out, let's say, unpleasant recollections that would weaken our preferred theory. Essentially, it's also known as having a selective memory, if you want. And this creates all sorts of problems in general, like overconfidence, attitude polarization, irrational primacy, and so on. But in evaluation, it's a problem because it leads us to believe that our preferred theory is true more often than it actually is. And it makes us focus our resources on our preferred theories disproportionately at the expense of other less comfortable, but probably more plausible theories. So what is Bayesian theory-based evaluation and how it can help solve these issues? So mitigate biases and improve transparency, credibility, and reliability. So it is essentially, at the core of it, it's a still theory-based evaluation. The main difference is that the evidence is formally assessed in terms of its power to alter our confidence that a certain theory is true. The other difference is that it measures the strength of the evidence, or if you want, the probative value of empirical observations for certain theories, and returns a formal level of confidence in a certain theory, which can be qualitative or quantitative. So instead of saying, these are our findings and we use these methods, we say, we have this level of confidence that this theory is true. And then we explain why, because the process is transparent. So there are dramatic improvements in transparency because the process leading to the confidence level estimation is a mathematical formula with numerical values, which can be translated into qualitative descriptors. And we need to argue why we chose those values or those level of confidence in a transparent manner. So potentially there are dramatic improvements in reliability if repeating the analysis leads to the same results. And also the formal assignment of a confidence level to the theory improves credibility. So what are the three building blocks of this method or approach? They're called theory, confidence, and empirical observations. So theory is an ontological entity. It's something that might be true, might not be true, something that might have happened, might not have happened. We usually don't know. We do the evaluation because we don't know, and it's usually unobservable. So some of these things happen in the minds of people, and we can't like open their brains. How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself as a mechanism and a sort of qualitative explanations, mostly process, a theory of change. For example, it could be a proposition or statement about the contribution of an intervention or the impact that an intervention has had. For example, intervention X influenced outcome Y or policy Y. So on the other hand, so we are quite familiar with the theory because we deal with theories of change all the time, even though not all the theories of change we deal with are explanations or mechanisms, causal mechanisms. So on the other extreme end, there are empirical observations. So they are empirical objects. They are observable. They are tangible. So it's much easier to agree on what we empirically observe because we can sort of see it. We can touch it with our senses, as opposed to what is true and what is not true ontologically. So usually in our experience, this will be data sets, content of documentation, accounts of, for example, meetings or interviews, transcripts, media, content, and so on. It could also be timelines, data patterns, interviews, and so on. And okay, I could say what are the types of, maybe we can talk about this later, like what are the types of empirical observations? There are like categories of empirical observations. Okay, and then how do we assess our confidence in the theory? We mentioned that we use the Bayes formula. And also we, in the quantitative version of the method, we think of confidence as a probability. A probability is a number between 0 and 1. And we set the initial confidence that the theory is true, or the claim or the mechanism as the prior. So we say before data collection, before making this empirical observation that we're trying to make in the course of the evaluation, we have this level of confidence in the theory. This is something that must be input into the formula. However, in my experience, this is not problematic because I like to set it at 0.5, so exactly in the middle between false and true. And because it's essentially an admission of ignorance, like I have no idea if this theory is true or not. This is why I'm doing the evaluation. Then Bayesian updating is the process of updating this confidence, turning it into the posterior, which is a conditional probability. It's a probability that the theory is true once we have observed evidence E, or we have made observation O. There is a different notation in the report. So this transition between the posterior, so our confidence after observing evidence, and our confidence before observing evidence, prior, posterior, is mediated by a mathematical formula known as the Bayes formula. And there are two formulations. I'm not going into too many details, but I want you to, we use the second one because in the second one we see the likelihood ratio, which is a measure of the strength of the evidence. I also don't have the time to go through this, even though the confusion matrix, or as I like to call it, the clarity matrix, is very useful in clarifying a lot of the in-depth concepts behind this way of thinking. So in the Bayes formula, there are essentially three components. As we can see, let's look at the bottom formalization. So we have priors times sensitivity, and then we have the inverse of the prior, which is basically very easy to calculate because it's 1 minus prior, the type 1 error, and the type 1 error. So if we set the prior at 0.5, then the only values that we need to work on are the sensitivity and the type 1 error. And the ratio between these two values is a measure of the probative value, the strength of the evidence, also known as the likelihood ratio. I'm not going through this different types of measuring the probative value, but the likelihood ratio is essentially the most popular. Also, the logarithm of the likelihood ratio, known as the weight of evidence. So we can represent the value of different pieces of evidence on a chart according to their sensitivity and type 1 error. Essentially, the sensitivity is the probability of making the observation if the theory is true, and the type 1 error is the probability of making the same observation if the theory is not true. So you can see that the bigger the difference is between these two quantities, the more the evidence strengthens the theory. Because, like, if making this observation is much more likely if the theory is true than if it isn't, and I do make the observation, then the theory is quite likely to be true, because if the theory weren't true, the chance of making the observation would be quite low compared to the chance of making it if the theory is true. So there is this chart which essentially, so if you plot the piece of evidence in this chart, and they are in this diagonal, then the pieces are very weak. So basically this chart helps you measure the strength of the evidence. And the farther away the piece of evidence are from the diagonal line, the stronger they are. We'll see this chart later. Now I want to say something about the qualitative, wait. No, I can't seem to, I lost my timer. Wait, sorry. Okay. The qualitative translation of these values. So I said that, remember, probability is a value between 0 and 1. But instead of saying, I don't know, 0.8, 0.5, 0.7, we can actually associate confidence level to ranges of these values. So you see that in this qualitative translation chart, 0.5 means that I'm neither confident nor not confident that something is true or not true. I just have no idea. And then if we go up, we are slowly, gradually more confident than not confident that, for example, a theory is true, or that we will observe a specific piece of evidence under the assumption that the theory is true or not true. And then the confidence grows as we go up. So it's like cautious confidence between 70 and 85, high confidence between 85 and 95, between 95 and 99 a reasonable certainty, and then practical certainty is like over 99%. And it's kind of in a mirror-like way, we have the negative values. So the lower they are, the least confidence we are that the theory is true, or the more confidence we are that the theory is false. So you see that the range, we can also see it in the slide. So there's a range of values between 0 and 1. We call it the confidence spectrum. And the closer I am to 0, the more certain or the more confident I am that the theory is false, or that a specific piece of evidence will not be observed. While the closer I am to the ones, the more confident I am that the theory is true, or that a certain piece of evidence will be observed. So I can just say, instead of saying this is the number, I can say I'm cautiously confident, or I'm highly confident, I'm practically certain, I'm reasonably certain, I'm just barely more confident than not, and so on. So when we estimate the values, this probably like the probability of observing this if the theory is true and if it's not true, which are the two values that we need to input into the Bayes formula. Instead of proceeding with a point estimate, we can just say I am highly confident, or I'm just like cautiously confident, and so on. And then this interval, this range, will have two extreme ends. So instead, I can do the updating process with the qualitative ranges, and then at the end, I essentially measure. I do like 4 updating calculations, and at the end, I'm given a range of confidence. A range of values, like 2 extreme ends, for the confidence that the theory is true. So instead of saying I am 85% confidence that the theory is true, I can say I am cautiously confident that the theory is true after having observed and assessed the evidence in this way. This is an example of the scenarios. But yes, I don't have time to go through this in detail right now. So this is intimately linked with the 4 process tracing tests, which some of you might have heard of: the smoking gun, the hoop test, the doubly decisive, and destroying the wind. Because those 2 quantities in the Bayes formula, this sensitivity and the type 1 error, characterize this test. So for example, the smoking gun, which is confirmatory or strengthening, but not necessarily weakening, has high specificity or low type 1 error, while it has average or low sensitivity. The hoop test has average of low specificity, or in other words, higher average type 1 error, because specificity and type 1 error are like opposites of each other, but has high sensitivity. Doubly decisive has both high sensitivity and high specificity, low type 1 error. Destroying the wind has neither. So destroying the wind is not conclusive. Doubly decisive is always conclusive, both because it confirms and both because it disconfirms. So I finished my 25 minutes. And you can see in this chart how the process tracing tests are located, where the process tracing tests are located. So you have the confirmatory area on the left, where the type 1 error is low. You have the disconfirmatory tests on the top, where the high sensitivity is high. And then the double decisive is both at the top and on the left. Destroying the wind is far from every interesting area and is actually close to the diagonal line. So it's weak, as I was saying earlier. Essentially, what are the steps of this approach or this method? We need to develop a testable theory first, which means a theory that can be meaningfully or closely connected to empirical evidence, that can be rejected or ruled out empirically at least, and ideally can be proven or confirmed. And sometimes in order to do this, we need to be very detailed in what we are describing or explaining, because it's much easier to link a detailed theory to empirical evidence as opposed to like a broad, ambiguous, high-level one. Estimate the prior confidence, which I suggest to set at 0.5, a neutral level. Then design data collection, having conclusive tests in mind, both confirmatory and disconfirmatory, to protect against confirmation bias. or at least strengthening and weakening. And then finally, formalize the process with probability estimates or likelihoods that you can translate or not into qualitative descriptors that are associated with numerical ranges. Finally, update confidence in the theory from the prior to the posterior using the Bayes formula. So I think these are the concluding remarks. So how shall I conclude this initial presentation? So first of all, Bayesian theory-based evaluation is theory-based evaluation. It's not something alien or completely different. The main difference is that instead of obsessing on the form the theory takes, like most TBE's approaches do, it is focused on the relation between empirical data and our confidence that the theory is true or not true, and it's mediated by the Bayes formula. It formally estimates our level of confidence that the theory is true or false, and formally measure the strength of the evidence or the probative value of specific empirical observations for a certain theory. So I guess that's it for the introduction, and I'm looking forward to the next phases of this seminar.
Well, Barbara, thank you very much for that introduction. Very clear, very concise, but it also, I'm sure that many of us find it challenging and something we need and want to learn more about. And of course, the first step then is to read the EBA publication, or rather the second step. The first step is to continue to engage in the conversation with Barbara now and to ask questions. And to start that, we have as our guest here, Gustav. You're very welcome, Gustav. Nice to see you here, Gustav Peterson. And it's a pleasure to have you here. And I think you are the one who wrote the last book for the Swedish audience on causal analysis, which I remember reading myself, and I found it very enlightening and very, very good. When Gustav is not here, he is a senior analyst at the Swedish Research Council. He's been on the board of the Swedish Evaluation Society in the past and has written a number of books for international audiences on evaluation methodological issues. You're welcome, Gustav, and over to you now for your first comments, questions on this, and maybe a discussion with Barbara.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this surely stimulating discussion. And thank you to Barbara for writing this very interesting report, which I'm sure will inspire many. And the first thing I want to do now is to point out that this report is certainly not only of great importance to the aid sector, but what's written in this report is relevant to all sectors where theories of change and similar theories are used. And when reading this report and listening to this very interesting presentation, I came to think several times of when I was working, as an example, in the education sector in different roles, first trying to gather and manage workshops with different stakeholders associated with a particular school development project, trying to elaborate on a program theory that everyone could agree on, and then with that as a starting point, trying to design an evaluation that would benefit as many as possible. And I do think that in many such situations, we would have been greatly helped, Barbara, by using the formal language that you are proposing in this report. Because as you say, there is no generally accepted way of moving from theory to data collection methods to empirical observation. And asking the question first, as you propose, which empirical observations would be particularly forceful to update our confidence in this theory? To start with that question and perhaps then move to data collection methods after that would surely have helped us greatly in many situations. And my first question to you now has to do with this first step of the method, where you want to translate the everyday language used by program makers and people who implement different kinds of programs into probabilities or into the qualitative descriptors that you use. You say in this report that there is still a lot of work to be done in this highly innovative field. Still a lot of work to be done on this, but you do propose that the shelf method should be used. And it would be great to hear you tell us a bit more about that. How we, when we gather at workshops and at different kinds of meetings where we discuss program theories and how we could test them the best way, how we should go about eliciting and synthesizing the different views of different stakeholders in this formal language.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Gustav, for the introduction and for the question. Maybe I should clarify that I'm not simply suggesting that we should use the shelf method in all circumstances. I actually suggest, there are several ways of eliciting these probabilities, and I would say that so far, the practice that I am familiar with and that I have been engaged with, the process is not as formal as in the shelf method. So these probabilities are normally, or these levels of confidence are normally estimated by the evaluation team. And sometimes there are rounds of feedback with various stakeholders. But essentially, it's the evaluation team who starts off with a proposal for the estimates. The shelf method is highly formalized because it's used in general for eliciting expert opinion, and it doesn't just elicit probabilities as single point estimates. First of all, it's quantitative, so it's kind of separate from the other option that you have, which is starting with the qualitative levels of confidence and associating this with a quantitative range. So the shelf method is purely quantitative, and it works. It doesn't directly estimate one single probability. What it does is try to estimate probability distributions. So, for example, there is a simple version where you start from the extremes, like the minimum and the maximum value, and then you try to understand what happens in between, like the quartiles or the tertiles and so on. And so when you have, there's another option which is basically a bit more sophisticated in terms of different, I think it's deciles or like different, let's say, parts of the probability distribution. And then once you have the probability distribution, you can say, okay, what is the expected value? And that would be the average. But in this sense, it's quite sophisticated. And I would say it's the academically recognized way of establishing expert opinion. So this is something that, I suggest when I receive criticism of this method to the effect of, there's no way of, it's not true that you improve credibility because there is no way of estimating these probabilities in a reliable way. So it's like they will always change. So this is actually not more robust than typical, than traditional theory-based evaluations. So first of all, I disagree with this because just the fact that you make the process a lot more explicit and subject to scrutiny is valuable. And then once you do this, there is a chance that actually the results are more reliable if you repeat the process and you get to the same findings. And you can do this, as I was saying, if under certain contexts and situations. And especially, I would say, if the process of gathering these opinions on the likelihoods of events is structured, there is a higher chance that the results in the end are reliable. I don't know if this answers your questions, but if not, let me know and I'll try to clarify.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you're telling us, Barbara. And I can give you a follow-up question on the qualitative descriptors that you suggest when you translate the probabilities into a language that are probably more close to the everyday language used by program makers. How neutral are they really? Can there be a bias also in using this language? What I mean is that we come from very many different disciplines in evaluation, for instance. Is there a risk, or is that just a fact that we may interpret the different qualitative descriptors that you propose differently? And what implications would that have then?
Yes, of course. And that's why, the recommendation is not that you should use that specific way of like cutting the cake, if you want. So what I suggest in my various publications is this one scale, because, comparing to the other scales that are out there in the literature, I think it has some distinct advantages. But there are also, like, for example, less fine-grained scales. Like I remember the first scale that I came across was like I think 0.33 very unlikely, 33 to 66 like about as likely as not. No, it was something like most of the first third was like unlikely, and then some kind of little area at the end was like very unlikely, and then from 33 to 66 was like about as likely as not. So it was like very vague, this whole big center part, and then the last third, like over 66, was like likely, and then the last beat, I think after 99 or 95, was like highly likely. So you see there are different ways of like creating these scales, but what matters is again transparency. The fact that when you say this is my level of confidence, you associate your level of confidence to a numerical range, and you say I have achieved this judgment because I use this procedure, and the procedure is repeatable. So that if you start with the same data, you end with the same results. And then you can see, let's test the sensitivity of this framework, and you can say, let's see what happens if I start with a different way of describing these ranges, and then you can repeat the same exercise with a different range and see what happens. So I think what we should aim for is kind of like repeatability of the exercises, but it's very, I don't think anyone is arguing for like certainty or the findings, or even in statistics, there's sometimes the reliability is very debatable, and now and then you read that there has been like some big statistical errors, for example in polls, like election polls and so on. But also academically, sometimes journals publish papers that say, sorry, we were wrong, sometimes even famous papers. So I think we shouldn't aim for absolute certainty or mathematical knowledge here. I think the aim should be increasing the transparency of the process that leads from the theory, or if you want, from the empirical data to the theory, and is mediated by the level of confidence. So we should be transparent in how we estimate our level of confidence that theories are true or not true.
Barbara, I was thinking of the evaluation challenges in development cooperation are very diverse and many. We could consider, for example, theories of change around how Swedish development cooperation works in a particular country. Like there would be one could be interested in finding out the impact of Swedish aid in Tanzania or Mozambique or whatever. That would be a kind of fairly high-level theory of change that you would need to formulate around that. But you could also have a theory of change, perhaps around impacts on a sector level or in relation to education, scientific collaboration, or health or whatever. And that would be kind of a mid-level theories, or you could also consider looking at specific project programs where there would be perhaps the lowest level of theory of change then. Is there any inherent difficulty in applying the methods at any of these levels? Would you advise us to go for the low-level theories of change first before trying anything else, or the other way around perhaps?
Yes, so I don't like to be very prescriptive about the kinds of theories that can be handled with this method, because it's still very young and there hasn't been much practice. So I don't want to say, just because I haven't seen it yet, I don't want to say, oh, don't try this with the high-level theories. Especially because it's compatible, for example, with social simulation, systems dynamics. So those kinds of theories are usually quite high level, and we can apply this logic to those kinds of theories. So in that case, it can also be used for like higher level theories. However, in my personal experience, more direct experience, I would say so far, and I want to stress so far, yes, it's been mostly applied to lower level theories, simply because it's much easier to connect the statements in the theory with empirical data. That is easily available. When something is described clearly, then you sort of visualize the empirical manifestation. So it's much easier. But I don't want to say that you should only apply this to lower level theories, because I think that would be a bit arrogant maybe, or a bit short-sighted, especially when you consider the application of the framework to different ways that the theory can be expressed.
We have a question from the audience here. We have actually quite a few of them. Maybe this one is relatively easy to respond to. Are there any more in-depth training courses out there?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, on this particular sort of Bayesian, because if you ask about training courses about process tracing, there is probably like a higher variety of the offer. About the specific Bayesian version, so far, I don't know others who are delivering them. But personally, I do this periodically, particularly with CCAN and the UCAS. We have a collaboration they call them master classes, which is a very pompous name if you want. Yeah, so there is one actually in very, very soon, I think in like 3 weeks' time, sometime in November. So yeah, I mean, if you want, you can sign up. It's going to happen very soon. Yeah, so it's if you want to find it, you should Google probably CCAN, UCAS, masterclasses, Bayesian updating, something like that.
Great, that's good to know. Another question here: how many evaluations have been made with this method in development aid or in other sectors? Would you know that? I mean, you do get quite an overview from your work, but have you any idea of frequency?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't made a census or anything. I haven't counted them, but there are a few. I'm not like the only person doing them. I've been involved in maybe 4 or 5 myself, and yes, there are other sort of I would say evaluators that are approaching theory-based evaluations in this way. Mostly, it is at the moment it is considered as like the Bayesian version of process tracing. So it's like, instead of doing traditional process tracing, we do it like this. But not only. For example, I've been involved in a quality assurance capacity in an evaluation that was initially, well, let's say it's been funded by Bayes, which is the department for, I think, business, environmental and industrial strategy of the UK government. And they combined this with realist evaluation. So they applied this logic to realist evaluation. But it's also true that after a while, they kind of abandoned the quantifications because they were saying we have too many mechanisms to look at. So it was like an issue of, as I was mentioning this morning, trade-off between breadth and depth. So they couldn't go in depth, at least in terms of like this kind of rigorous assessment of the data for all the theories. I think they had like something like 17 theories. But I mean, I think for one round of the evaluation, they did that. Yes, and then I don't know. I mean, if you want me to give you a list, I can. But also in the World Bank source book that I presented this morning, there is, I think, essentially all that was being done at the time of publication. So I think that's very up to date, bar anything that's happened in the last like 6-7 months, maybe 8 months. But
yeah. Fine, and thanks for the response, Barbara. We have a question from Ingela Ternström. Please, Ingela, go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to link this presentation, which I found very, very interesting, to the discussion we had this morning, where one of the sort of main findings of the EBA report presented then was that the evaluations do not use methodologies that are available. And I think when I listen to this presentation, it's very interesting, but it's also quite technical. And I think one of the reasons that evaluators may not be so prone to use sort of more modern approaches is that it's a different field of competence. An evaluator is often an expert on development aid, but perhaps not as much an expert on research methodologies. And I also think that when you are looking for an evaluator in tenders, etc., you look for the experience of doing many evaluations or evaluations in a particular field, but you do perhaps not put as much value on the methodological competence of the evaluators. That's just a reflection to link to this morning's discussions.
Barbara, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting reflections. Actually, off the top of my head, I can think of, I mean, it's difficult to think of like an evaluator who would be like, say, leading the evaluation, or who would be the principal investigator for an evaluation, who themselves want to learn how to use the new methods. For example, it's very similar for QCA. Maybe for this, it's even more pronounced, if you want, the difficulty, because the initial learning curve is quite steep, as I was saying. But at the same time, yes, it's rare. But I would say that when this does not happen, so when the, let's say, lead evaluator or the principal investigator does not want to make the investment, you have teams. I mean, you can create teams where individuals have different types of expertise. And when I work in evaluations, applying this method, I am never the principal investigator. I am never the lead evaluator, never the team leader. So I'm always the methodological advisor. And in a way, there is an initial moment where this kind of knowledge transfer needs to happen, which can be a little bit like, I don't want to say awkward, but like, yes, there is some learning that is happening. So, eventually everyone in the team learns something. So I learn about the substantive knowledge, let's say the field, the particular field in development, or or I don't know if it's education, or if it's social issues, or I don't know, transport, whatever, and they learn more about the method. So in all my advisory work, it's the same process at the beginning. So there is kind of this exchange, mutual exchange knowledge. I don't know.
That's the evaluation teams and the evaluators and your own role in terms of methodological advice. But what about the commissioners? Would you have any specific reflections on there? What to do as a commissioner of evaluations?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a session more like about commissioners. I think that follows shortly, but I would say right now, what I can say in a short time is that normally this actually comes from commissioners. So it's quite rare in my view that an evaluation team says we want to apply this method because we have our own personal interest in learning about this method. It always happens because there's a demand from commissioners. So it's commissioners that are somehow attracted by the features of the method, by the potential, by what it can offer. And then they write this into bids, into tenders, call for tenders. And so that's why then evaluators think, well, maybe we need to learn more about this, because they know that there's a demand from the commissioning side.
Do you see any particular obstacles on the commissioning side? If let's go into that topic now, because we have some 3-4 minutes to devote to the commissioner's role, and then we switch to the deep dive for evaluators at 2:00. So.
Oh, is it already? Because I thought I had to prepare a presentation on commission.
No, it was for 5-6 minutes of a particular reflection on the commissioner's role.
Okay, so we are already in that kind of session.
Yeah.
Then. Oh, okay. Yes, so I can.
Time flies.
Yes, sorry. So can you repeat the question? What you're saying, challenges on the commissioning side?
Well, I was actually following up on your explanation on the importance of commissioners to in terms of reference, emphasize the kind of methodological expertise they expect in tenders and so. What else is there to consider for commissioners? What do they need to learn, to study, to know? Because in a way, even less than evaluators, they might, as Ingela pointed out, to be familiar with research methods and so on.
Yes. So in my experience, commissioners are maybe surprised at the kind of evidence that this method is hungry for. And it's often quite confidential, at least in policy influence evaluation, which is a field where this method is very popular at the moment. So for example, in a recent evaluation that I was involved in, I mean, I wouldn't say they were on board with it and they were very happy about the method, but yes, they didn't expect us, the evaluators, to ask for like emails from 5 years ago, or to ask them to sort of search through their emails for what was said specifically at that point in time, by whom, and what was the reaction and so forth. And we write emails every day and we mostly forget the content because there's just too many, so just this kind of digging is usually not something that they experience with other method. And also in terms of like evaluation management, maybe this is of interest to commissioners, but like less directly. It's important to for the stakeholders, or for the, let's say, holders of information that is of interest to the evaluation, to trust the process. And I mean, this is always important, so you have to be very open around issues of confidentiality and how you will treat the information. But because this is like more in depth and potentially more confidential information, then this needs to be strengthened even more. So I've had varied situations, and in some cases there is good communication and the information is made available. But in other cases, it's not so easy. And in one extreme case, they said that they would provide the information, and at the end they didn't provide anything, and there was some kind of like order from the top that they had to stop collaborating with the evaluation. I mean, it was many years ago, and it was just one case, but this is a potential risk that is a bit higher with this method than with others, I would say.
That's interesting. Trust is, of course, a very, very important aspect of evaluation management, and as it is a contractual relation with expectations on a high-quality product and something which is useful and often critical. It can be very, very important to pay attention to. Well, we can perhaps get back to that, but I mean, it's not at all that we in any way have been superficial up to now, but now is the time for the deep dive. And again, over to you, Barbara, with a deep dive for evaluators and method geeks.
To me? Well,
yes.
Okay. So I was told that I didn't need to prepare any presentation for this session. So I guess the way I imagine this to happen is that if you have any detailed questions about what I presented, I can give you some, demonstration of how the method works, maybe, or I can answer questions in more detail about the way it's applied. For example, something I could show you is that there are two files that I could potentially show you. One is an Excel file that's used for the updating, which is quite, in a way, simple because it's essentially the base formula file, and you input the data, and then the formula updates the prior into the posterior, and you can do it for different situations, and you can also aggregate data for different observations and so on. The other file is something that has been prepared for a specific evaluation, and it was a situation where essentially I was trying to encourage the stakeholders to come up with the estimates themselves. So I prepared a file with multiple choice menu with different levels of confidence, and then they could see how that depending on their estimates on the sensitivity and type 1 error and what that meant and so on, they could see how the posterior confidence was updated in the claim. But let's keep this very free-flowing, and if there is anything that you would like me to clarify, I think this is what this session is for.
Yes, please, Gustav.
Okay. Well, thank you, Barbara. I have a question which relates to an everyday situation that I think all evaluators have come across. We often end up in evaluations with surveys or similar material that radiates in many different directions, where you have questions asked to different stakeholders and to different customers that are asked on a particular scale. How pleased are you with this intervention? How beneficial has it been to your work? From 1 to 10, and the average is perhaps 7. If you end up with such messy empirical data as we often do, can we still somehow use this method? I am fully aware that this is not where you want us to end up, and I took a note when you were having your introductory presentation before. You told us that we should design data collection having conclusive tests in mind, such as the 4 process tracing tests. But if we cannot fully influence the choice of data collection methods, can we somehow afterwards still find value in this method?
Yes, I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. I guess what I say when I say you should design data collection with conclusive tests in mind, especially if you can doubly decisive, is that if you focus on that kind of evidence, then you are guaranteed to update your prior, to significantly alter your confidence in the theory one way or another. So either increasing it or decreasing it. So, that's in a way, that's a kind of a surefire way of making this method, I would say, fully relevant, or mostly relevant, because you can say, thanks to this method, I can clearly formalize my level of confidence, and it's quite convincing one way or the other. So that's the ideal situation. But at the same time, if you're not in a position to do this, this method can also be useful because you can use to make sense of like chaos, or sort of messy situations. And you do this because you constantly ask yourself, what does this data tell me about the theory? So the interesting thing is that once you are asked, you are required to make a transparent, clear, explicit estimate of the power of the evidence to change your confidence in the theory. Then you ask this question. Even if you cannot be formal, you continue to ask the question, because it's like I asked myself this question like 3 times in the past, and now I continue to do it. So it's almost like a habit. It becomes a habit. I mean, personally, I think about this this approach and like the sensitivity and type 1 error thing, and in almost anything, it's been years now. But no, I think so. There are 2 questions that are fundamental in this approach, and so there is no reason why you cannot ask these questions of data that are already available, and you can make an estimate on the value of the data for a theory. And since the data has not been collected specifically to support the theory or reject the theory, then there's a likelihood that it's going to be relevant and it's not going to tell you much about the theory. But this is not guaranteed. It can also happen that that data is actually relevant for the theory. And actually, the more data you have, the higher the chance that at least something will be useful. So you just need to sort of keep digging and asking yourself, what does this tell me about the theory? And if you want to formalize this thinking, it's even better. But I can say more about because it's very, there's a lot of ways of framing this asymmetry. So the asymmetry is essentially between strengthening evidence and weakening evidence. I had 2 slides in the presentations, but I had to remove them eventually because I only had 25 minutes. But like, this is the same with process tracing tests. Sometimes it's called uniqueness and certainty. I'm not a big fan of those two terms, but the idea is that some evidence is conclusive when you observe it, but it's not conclusive if you don't observe it, which would be the smoking gun. And then the other type is conclusive if you don't observe it, but it's not conclusive if you observe it, and that would be the hoop test. And then there are the kind that is never conclusive, whether you observe it or not, and the doubly decisive is always conclusive when whether you observe it or not. So if you observe it, it strengthens. If you don't observe it, it weakens. So asking questions about what's the chance of observing this if the theory is true and if the theory is not true helps you identify which tests you are talking about. So which one of the 4 categories you are closest to. And then eventually with the use of the Bayes formula, you can automatically update your confidence in the theory. And there's no reason why you cannot do it with any kind of data available. Sorry, but maybe the answer was a bit too long, but.
If I may reflect just a bit on that, what you're saying, it's very interesting, these 4 tests that you bring in from the process tracing field. At the same time, I think if we are in this beneficial situation that we haven't yet collected our data and we have these different tests in mind, at the same time, it seems to me not an easy thing to argue in evaluation oftentimes that a particular piece of evidence would be a smoking gun, because it's a very special situation, perhaps. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit more, and perhaps you could give us some more examples on when you actually found evidence that you would consider a smoking gun in relation to a particular intervention?
Yeah, so the reason why I'm a sort of convinced proponent of the Bayesian formalization is that, as you say, it's a big statement to say it's a smoking gun, because it's essentially a deterministic statement. You say the evidence is conclusive, which is like saying the theory is proven and that's it, and that's not exactly how we experience uncertainty. I mean, I think we the reason I like to have a level of confidence is that I'm not comfortable saying, this is confirmatory, this is conclusive. I mean, I'm just not comfortable with this kind of deterministic language in our situations. So yeah, I mean, I think I understand your point, but at the same time, with the nuances, with the sort of you can say, I don't know, I would say something that increases your confidence from the middle point to reasonable certainty. It's quite conclusive. So maybe the same type of evidence from someone who uses, let's say, the traditional categorical process tracing, they would say, yes, this is a smoking gun. So yes, you do find those things sometimes. For example, in this recent evaluation of policy influence that I was involved in, and actually there are several examples in the report about specific application cases. 3 are policy influence, but there are also other examples in other fields. So yeah, just to give you a quick example now. So in our case, we were trying to reconstruct processes. So the theories describe the process and the importance of the process for a certain goal. But essentially, it was a pretty long theory. So it was like a series of bullet points, and some of these bullet points were more like descriptive. So not all of them were causal statements. The causal statement was like the overarching statement. And then it was like split up into sub-statements, which were like a little bit more descriptive. So we for some of these sub-statements, we found emails, as I was mentioning, and I think emails are quite strong evidence if you have if you can be sure that the email is authentic, for example. So I don't know if they take a screenshot or if they show you the emails. I mean, because in theory they could be sort of manipulating the email, and and then we can discuss like what are the incentives of people who participate in these kinds of processes to falsify the evidence. So we can discuss this. I don't think they're very high because we're not working for the CIA or things like that. But if you don't trust them, you can show you can ask them to show you the email like in when they share screens. So if they share their screens with the email, there's no way to falsify it because it's in the archive. So, and of course, maybe they show you only some part of the story and you're missing other parts of the story. But there are some things that are quite specific. So you say, unless this sort of catastrophic event happened 3 days later, then this is quite strong evidence that, this part of the process actually took place.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. May I perhaps reflect on other discussions that we have had in the past? I think in the previous report you wrote for EBA, we spoke about causality and our understandings of causality, and I connected to that in relationship to the theories of change, because the quality of the theories of change will of course be quite important for the quality of what follows. in terms of analysis. And I think one can confess that many of the theories of change that one can see in project documents, etc., they are somewhat lacking. When you have talked about theories or about causality before, and you also, Gustav, we have talked about what is called inus conditions, where you talk about causal packages and things that may be insignificant in themselves in terms of causal relations, but being part of a causal package that perhaps in itself is not so important. But how can you develop the theories of change to incorporate that kind of causal thinking? Speaking of causal packages rather than more simplistic elements of a theory of change, or does it become too complicated for the theory-based methods?
You mean in specifically in relation to this method, or like in general?
Specifically relating to this method.
Yes. I mean, as I was saying, I don't like to be too prescriptive about the kind of theories that that can be used, but the first step of the application of the method is what I describe as developing testable theories. So what does testable mean? It means that there needs to be a close link between what is stated and evidence, empirical evidence, that is either available or that can potentially become available, after research. So this is quite important because the theory needs to be falsifiable in a way. So you need to be able to think of conditions under which the theory can be weakened as well as strengthened. Because if the theory, I don't know, if you cannot think of evidence that can either support the theory or rule out the theory, reject the theory, weaken the theory, then that's not the right kind of theory for this method. So the good news is that for me, it's difficult to think of theories that cannot work for this method unless, for example, they're very broad. Like, this is a very extreme example, but for example, the existence of God, or for example, God was responsible for this event or for this outcome. It's not something that can be proven empirically. So, but this is a very extreme examples. But I would say another situation where I think it's difficult to apply this method is when you have like very broad theories of change, especially theories that link intervention activities to sort of ultimate outcomes that are supposed to materialize after 15 years and, go through a series of like complex dynamics in order to materialize. So, unless you are able to break down theory very in high detailed and explain how the different steps are related, and this is kind of similar to contribution analysis in a way. So that's also why this method is combined with contribution analysis, and a lot of people call it contribution tracing, and now this term is so popular that it even made it into the tender of the Foreign Office, which used to be known as DFID in the UK, and so they are tendering now for a framework, evaluation framework, and they mention specifically contribution tracing. So I was saying, and normally when you have these kinds of theories about that describe a process and like the different steps in the process and what needs to happen for like to go from one step to the other, this can be linked to the theory of causality as you were mentioning. For example, I think John Main wrote some papers after our joint study in 2012 with Elliot Stern, saying that in contribution analysis, all the parts were necessary for the whole theory to hold, and the whole theory as a package was sufficient. So in this case, the single components are inus because they're not I mean, to say that they're necessary for the theory to hold, it's not the same as saying that they are necessary for the result in general. So that's a difference between sort of absolute necessity and sort of local necessity or honest necessity. But also other, like, the major theorists of process tracing, like Derek Beach, for example, at least in his papers of like a few years ago, I'm not sure if he's had any rethinking about this, but I don't think so. So he was saying that, when he describes process tracing mechanisms as a conjunction, a concatenation of like entities engaged in activities, he talks about interlocked components. So all the components are necessary for the mechanism to exist. So in this sense, I think you can link like most of the theories that can be handled with this method, or that I've seen people handling with this method, including myself. You can apply to these kinds of theories, but at the same time, what makes this method, I would say, peculiar and different, it's not linked to the way the theory is expressed. So I want to stress this very, very clearly, because it's also something that we discussed a lot where we were preparing the report, and this is not simply Bayesian process tracing. So Bayesian process tracing is this logic applied to process tracing, but then process tracing is quite highly codified. We applied the same method to system-based, agent-based modeling, to realist evaluation. So it is something that is not linked to any other label, if you want, or particularly restricted way of illustrating the theory. But yes, when you develop a theory, you need to ask yourself, is this closely linked to empirical evidence? Because if it isn't, I'm going to struggle very hard in applying the method, because that's ultimately the requirement of the method.
Fine, thanks. That's clear. I would just like to say, as you all see, if you ask a question to Barbara, you get a very clear, concise, and comprehensive answer. So please don't be afraid. Raise your hands. I'll try to make sure that I notice raised hands, and we'll forward the question to Barbara, or you can ask it yourself to Barbara. In the meantime, Gustav, please go ahead.
I think it's very interesting all that you're telling us, Barbara. I think we're talking about many different kinds of theories and approaches now, and on one level, I think it's very valuable that you point out to us that this method can be applied in relation to all kinds of theory-based evaluation. So that's realistic evaluation, program theory evaluation, and so on. And that's, of course, a great strength of this method. Theory on another level, I wanted to ask you also today, as you know very well, I know your work on causal inference pretty well, and on the different theories of causation that are implicit in many of our different approaches in the field of evaluation. For instance, the counterfactual theory of causation is implicit in the randomized control trial. And when using different approaches in evaluation, that means that we also implicitly draw on different theories of causation. So I wonder, is that the case also when using theory-based diagnostic Bayesian evaluation, that we draw on a particular theory of causation rather than another one? Or is it neutral?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's not neutral. I am not completely sure about this because, as I was saying, I don't want to be too sure about too many things because it's, it's very new. And my hope for the next few years is that as many people test it and try it, like in as many evaluations as possible, and then we will know more. We will have like much more certain answers to more questions. But no, I mean, so far in my experience, I would say that, as I was saying, it is theory-based evaluation. And in my, as far as I understand it, theory-based evaluation is like overwhelmingly based on mechanism-based causation, or like the generative theory of causality, which is quite distinct, for example, from Mills methods, or for multiple conjunctural causation. So normally I like to make this a clear distinction between these three kinds, even though there are like, subtypes, and we can discuss more about, causality models and things. But I think these three types are quite distinct. So Mills methods, and then the multiple conjunctural causation, which also have some elements of Mills method, but they are substantially different. And then finally, generative causation. So it's, the famous, sometimes this is referred to as like opening the black box. It's like you want to understand how the cause generated the effect, like what happened during the transformation of the cause into the effect. And and there are many theory. I mean, normally when I think about theories of change or theory-based evaluation, I sort of put a lot of evaluation approaches or methods into this box, like, for example, contribution analysis, realist evaluation, all the systems-based approaches, which, as I was saying this morning, that there are so many, and also process tracing, of course. So for me, this is all part of theory-based evaluation. In fact, I have in the report, I have a figure. I think it's the first figure in the report, in the introductory chapter, where I try to map in, if you want, the field of theory-based evaluation, and also try to explain that we're doing something different. So what we're doing relates to the entire field of theory-based evaluation, and it doesn't focus on like the way that the theory is expressed. So for me, like the whole field is generative causation, and then there are changes in like the ways that the theory is expressed. For example, in contribution analysis, you usually have like a relatively long process with intermediate outcomes. You start on the activities and the outputs, and then the reactions, and then the reach, and then the behavioral change, and so on, and until the ultimate outcomes, the changes in livelihood, for example. And then for each step, you have assumptions that need to hold, in order to move to the next step, and that's a pretty important part of the chain, because if the assumptions don't hold, then it's unlikely that you'll be able to move on to the next part. But also the risks, like what you need to be aware of, which is also a threat to moving on along the pathway. But so I guess that's fairly specific. And if you have realist evaluation, you have the context, mechanism, outcome, configuration, or sometimes it's called the realist egg, because in the seminal textbook on realist evaluation, it was like depicted as an egg, with the mechanism at the center, the outcome on the right, and the context on the left. And then there's countless ways of representing systems in systems-based evaluation. I'm not even trying to list it, but what I'm trying to say, and then again, process tracing, which is more codified in terms of entities engaging in activities and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that with this method, we're not looking at how the theory is codified. This is all generative causation. These are all ways of explaining how the causes transform into the effect, produce the effect, in high detail, almost as if you are observing the causal process while it's taking place. Fine, so we accept all of this, but our focus is on the relation with empirical data, like what do the data tell us about this process? Because this process is likely took place 3 years ago, 3 months ago, in the past. They haven't been observed directly, like you haven't seen directly the process, but the process has left some traces. So we're interested in finding these traces to reconstruct what happened that we couldn't see directly, basically.
Thank you, Barbara. I'd just like to say that if you want to read more about causality. I mean, you wouldn't say it, Gustav, but your book is probably the first thing one should read. And having finished that, you can go to Barbara's previous report for EBA from 2017 on qualitative comparative analysis, where there is an annex talking about forms of causal analysis. And if you're not happy with that, there is a nice slim little book by Canadian professor John Lossy on the history of causality. I mean, everything has a history, so does causality, of course. So that's further reading. Would you like to follow up?
Yes, I have follow questions.
Yeah. Yes.
So many interesting aspects of this. Well, I'm wondering a bit more broadly and in the political context of evaluation. As we all know, in the AIDS sector and in many other sectors as well, perhaps most sectors, there are today strong demands for greater rigor in evaluation. And you are arguing that we should use this method to gain more rigor in theory-based evaluation. I think we're all familiar in this room with the situation where sometimes experimental evaluations are proposed because they tend to be rigorous, but not necessarily focus on the question, the why question, the way that we would like sometimes to develop the interventions that we are about to finish. Would you like to elaborate a bit more, Barbara, on what you think the potential of this method is and what it could mean for the field of theory-based evaluation when it comes to meeting these increasing demands for rigor?
Yes. So first of all, what does rigor mean? I mean, it's funny that there's all this talk about rigor, but it's seldom like clearly linked with quality dimensions. So for example, I really like to talk about quality instead of rigor because especially when you have like a multidimensional framework for quality and what evaluation quality means, you understand that this definition of rigor is left implicit and it could refer to maybe one or two dimensions, but certainly not to all of them, you know. So that's why I think it's very important to understand that evaluation quality is many things, you know, and it's conceptual framing, it's appropriateness, it's also construct validity, which, you know, the proponents of rigor not necessarily mention. But I mean, in my interpretation, if I have to interpret like what most people mention when they say rigor, they link it to robustness. So I guess the notion of robustness is linked to reliability. It's the idea that, you know, if you repeat the study, you get the same result. So for example, when you do a survey, you have a sample size. Why do you want to have the sample size? Because you want the results to be reliable. So you want the results to come attached with a confidence interval. So you say 95% of the time that we extract the sample in this way, we get a result with this confidence level. So the result can vary like this much. And usually you want this interval to be small. So there is not a lot of uncertainty around the result. Maybe it's not the specific number, but it's not much different. So that's one specific dimension of rigor. And is also linked, another dimension of rigor is internal validity. So for example, when we make causal statements about the net effect, for example, we want the counterfactual to be really good. So we want to isolate the effect of the intervention. And, you know, but we know that sometimes this is not possible. And if this is not possible, then they say that the causality statement is not internally valid. But anyway, I accept this because this method is not to calculate the net effect. So this method is for when you have like a causal statement about how and why a program has worked or is supposed to work. So it's not about the net effect question, or I would say maybe, I don't know, there are some like limited circumstances under which it can also be useful to answer this kinds of questions. I mean, I'm sure there are, because Bayesian formula is used literally anywhere. Like, is used in police crime investigation. It's used in law. It's used in medical diagnosis. So that's also why I don't want to be too prescriptive, in saying it's not useful in net effect. But like, in evaluation so far, the kind of like use and habits and culture that we're building, that's not what you think when you want to estimate the net effect of something. I mean, there's so many experimental methods, quasi-experimental methods that are out there. They are well known. There's a lot of literature around it. This is what you would go for. But if you're interested, not so much in like measuring the net effect and knowing precisely how much difference the intervention made, but if you want to understand more why the intervention made that difference or any difference, or how and why the difference was made, like what was the specific contribution of the intervention, and you want to sort of create a causal model to understand whether the intervention will work in the future, will continue to work under different contexts, then you need explanations, you need causal mechanisms, you need to explain the outcome. So that's when this method comes in handy. And then what happens is that the method that you normally use to answer these kinds of questions are a bit lacking in terms of reliability, because first of all, there is a lack of transparency. So as I was saying at the beginning, it's hard to reconstruct the process leading to the conclusions. Because you say this is the context analysis, and this is the interviews that we made, and this is what we discovered. But then there's no link between the interviews that you made and your statements at the end, and your findings. So how do you reconstruct that process? Where do you even start? I mean, this is partially covered, but I think in my view, and obviously also in the views of critics of these approaches, it's not good enough to reconstruct the process, because especially if you compare it to statistical analysis. I mean, statistical analysis, you can just say this is the data set, you just do the same analysis and you will achieve the same findings because it's a mathematical formula, and this is also why I think QCA is attractive from this perspective, because you have an algorithm that you apply to a data set, and if you do the same type of analysis twice, you still you achieve the same results twice. So okay, now I forgot where I started, and what. No, wait, you started from the notion of rigor.
Interesting what you're saying, Barbara, that this method definitely comes in handy when you ask the why question. That's perhaps when the benefits materialize the most, rather than when you're asking for the net effect. That's very interesting. And I think it's very nice that you bring up the question of what is rigor really, because there are, of course, many different views on that. I come to think, for instance, also on the works of, for instance, of Helen Simmons and Michael Patton, who would rather say admitting bias is also another way of achieving rigor. Make it transparent by admitting it rather than getting rid of it and achieving replicability. And of course, there is room for many different such perspectives in evaluation. But the why question and the benefits of this method, it's very interesting to hear.
I have a question that I've been thinking of a little bit. In development cooperation, perhaps more in many other fields, some of the more important effects can be unexpected and even unwanted. The negative impact of Aedes is not a negligible phenomenon. Michael Scriven wrote about this already in the 1980s, 90s, and launched the concept of goal-free evaluation. One doesn't see that practiced very often, maybe best so, I'm not so sure. But can goal-free evaluation is that, say, at all possible to connect with theory-based evaluation? It seems like you have to have a theory about something, but if you do a goal-free evaluation, you shouldn't have a theory. Or can you somehow build a theory around the unwanted effects in a way that, so to say, satisfies both the requirements of the theory-based evaluation and the dangers of looking for objectives that Scriven warns us against when we look for unwanted effects? What do you say, Barbara?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say this doesn't link specifically to Bayesian theory, but for example, to process tracing. I mean, I don't know, this actually depends also how you do theory-based evaluation in general, but I would say for process tracing, it's a bit more codified, like there is literature around inductive process tracing, deductive process tracing. It's also a bit true for example, QCA, like you can do it more deductively or more inductively. But yes, essentially, I think it's a matter of like induction or deductions. Like, how do you design your research or your evaluation? Do you start from a theory and do you say, I want to collect data to test this particular theory? Or do you start more inductively, like, I have no idea what's going on here. I'm just going to look around and then try to sort of build plausible theories along the way, depending on what evidence I find that I think can strongly support any theory. And I think in my view, in process tracing, as I was saying, with this method, but also without, this happens quite often. And the question in that case is not so much like designing data collection so that having in mind conclusive tests for a particular theory. It's like the opposite. So you observe any kind of evidence, like literally the evidence that you kind of come across, and you obviously explore. So you cast your net widely, but during the exploration, you ask yourself, okay, well, what does the evidence that I came across support? What kind of theory does it support? And it's very free. It's very not just goal free, but also in a way free of any particular theory or particular form that the theory can take. Because it's inductive and is linked to the evidence that you are observing. Yeah, and it can be close to the initial theory of change, or it can be very different. I don't know if this is clear. Maybe
And it's encouraging. That's fine. Gustav, can you see the Research Council commissioning this kind of evaluations? Or are you already doing it?
No, we're not already doing it. Could perhaps do. Rigor is, of course, a very important issue. Though in the research area, you don't necessarily always work with a theory to test. That's not always the case, of course. Well, I have another question to you, Barbara, also. I would like to hear you elaborate a bit more on where you see that this method could be particularly useful and where it's underutilized so far. Do you see any particular sector where you think it should be? I said initially that I think it could be used in most sectors, of course, but is there any particular sector where you see that it is not as much used as it should be? Is there any particular kind of intervention that you think could perhaps be appropriate to evaluate by this method?
I mean, if you ask me, where should it be used? My answer is almost, I don't know, because as I was saying, I don't want to be too prescriptive, but I can say where it is being used, maybe most often, and at the moment, it's being very widely used in policy influence. I'm not sure why. Like, I would like to understand why. It could be because there are not many valid options in the area. Like, for example, we all know about quasi-experimental or experimental approach in health, for example, in education. But for policy influence, there is a bit of a dearth of, or a lack of, I would say, methods with a good reputation, if you want, at least from in some circles. So I think they are drawing on this method quite disproportionately. While, you know, maybe for other sectors there is a sort of a wider range of possibilities. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like should, I don't have an answer in terms of sector. At the same time, I think this method can be used, should be used in evaluations that are particularly sensitive, if you want, where there can be a lot of potential conflict around the results. And of course, you know, when you hear this, perhaps the first method that comes to your mind is, I don't know, some kind of systems-based or complexity-based participatory method, like, for example, participatory system mapping, and sort of you want to give the stakeholders a chance to you know, air their perspectives, but also, you know, visualize the way they see, you know, that specific reality in the system and so on. But at the same time, if this is not enough and you actually need to come to a conclusion about, you know, for example, because it's a decision that will move like a huge amount of funding, so you need, you know, particularly high standard for the credibility of the results, then I think this can be useful because you focus on the credibility of a final statement that you want consensus around. And I think even though there are various ways of like, you know, getting people to discuss together and agree on something, I think this is compatible with both participatory approaches and a final score, if you want, or level of confidence on the findings. And I don't think many other methods can, if you want, combine, you know, these two aspects. Yeah, so this is what I would say, even though I forgot the question again.
The higher the stake of the evaluation, the greater the need for rigors. And that's, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think you summed it up pretty well. Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
I see a question here. Could this method be used for evaluation of capacity development of people or organizations? That connects to a reflection I made when you spoke of policy influence. And there was a time when I became a little bit uncertain with what one should mean with that, because I can see on the one hand, way we talk about policy influence in development cooperation, it is influenced by, for example, NGOs like Save the Children on child labor in the country, hence shaping government policy in a particular field. So policy influence would be about how you influence the policies made, but it could also be used to describe what happens afterwards, once the policy is in place. What happens? What influence does policy have? Yeah. And do you mean both? Or I would guess you mean both, in fact, because you could well imagine theories of change in both cases. But did you have any particular in mind? And perhaps this question about the evaluation of capacity development of people organizations reflect to the, well, it could actually reflect to both kinds of policy influence, both uses of a word.
Yes, that's a really interesting observation. I mean, mostly I meant the first kind. So it's like when you have lobbying, advocacy, you know, by NGOs and organizations that ultimately result, or you think result in some kind of law being passed, some kind of legislation being passed by parliaments. So this is what I had in mind. But at the same time, if something is passed as a law, if something is like adopted, let's say, as a framework and so on, it doesn't necessarily have practical consequences. In fact, like even at the law legislative levels, like some of the case studies that I come across, it's always like, yes, the result is clear, so we influence the legislation, but then the law was not implemented. You know, it's been 5 years and nothing has been done. So you have to also distinguish, you know, what kind of outcome you are talking about. And, you know, some outcomes are maybe less relevant than others, or they're just like one step in the pathway. But in terms of, I think, the organizational development, it's interesting. I guess you could say that maybe because you're trying to describe a process, so maybe you could identify a point in time where something was done. Let's say an organization had decided to, I don't know, implement some specific activities, theorizing that they would lead to some kind of outcome. And then, yes, you can definitely test if this process has materialized, and if not, what else has happened as a consequence of this policy change. Because obviously, when we talk about policy, we can mean, public policy of governments, but we can also mean organizational policy or policy of organizations and institutions and so on. So yes, in that sense, it's very interesting. What are the consequences of this policy change in the organization, and either goal-free, more inductive, but also, whatever has been achieved, is it consistent with the initial goals, and so on. So yeah, I don't see why any time you have not initially at first, but also okay. So what I want to say is, anytime you have a process at the beginning, or a theory of change, or a causal mechanism that is explaining something, yes, you can use this method. But also, you don't need to have this specified clearly at the beginning. You can also have this in mind as something that you will develop at some point in the research, and you want to develop this inductively. But yes, at some point you will have this, and yes, whenever you will have this at some point in the research, yes, you can apply the method.
Yeah, one can of course think in different ways about the strengths and weaknesses of methods and approaches, and I have in no way made up my mind around this, but in the discussions we are having, I'd like to throw out the hypothesis. Is it possibly so that the processes that you are forced to engage in as an evaluation team and with participants means that you speak a little bit less about the intervention, and we often call it intervention, but it could be the project, the programs, etc., and a little bit more about substantive change in societies, in organizations, etc. And if that's so, I would say that's a very good thing, because many evaluations that I see deal far too much with the interventions and with the organizations managing, asking for the intervention, and too little about the reality, too little about the context around it. And does this force that kind of considerations on the whole process? I had a hypothesis that maybe it does, but I'm not sure, and I haven't really seen it practiced. So.
For me, so the fact that whatever you claim needs to be claimed with such high standards of confidence kind of automatically makes you more humble and makes you more open to the idea that actually something else might have happened instead of your preferred theory. And then at that point, if there is uncertainty about the theory, there is also potential uncertainty about the result, that has been achieved. So I think in a way, the method makes you a bit more humble. So when you have this more humble approach, then you want to start from looking at first what has happened, what is the situation like, and oftentimes that's not easy to understand, especially in complex systems, where in dynamic system, and when there is a lot of uncertainty. So I think in a way, maybe not quite as much directly as you would like, Kim, but I think, within an overall humbling process, I think, yes, it's likelier that you focus more on systemic change or what has changed. And then you later look at what were the determinants of this change and what contributed to this change. And finally, if your intervention has contributed, while in some situations there's this kind of fixation with the intervention, and also like more technically, like this method makes confirmation bias more obvious, than it normally is. And there is also a very technical way of understanding this. For example, when the estimates of the sensitivity are too low, it means that you are downplaying the potential of the evidence to weaken your theory, and that can be linked to confirmation bias. So you should always be very suspicious when the sensitivity is too low, because it means that you don't want to admit that the evidence can rule out the theory. And also when the estimates of the type 1 errors are too low, it's also suspicious, because it's indicative of a thought where nothing else could have, but your theory could have caused the evidence to be observed. So, it's an indication of essentially of confirmation bias and of the fixation on your theory. So I think, becoming humble in relation to your theory makes you more open, not only to different theories, but also like to different things that might have happened more widely in the system.
Doesn't that then point to the importance of a dialogue and the trust between those who commission and who do the evaluations? Because, often uncertainty is not a very welcome aspect of an evaluation report. Clients often want you to be, I would think, far more assertive than you many times can be.
Yes, what can I say? This is maybe a larger topic, about the relation between science and policies, and how far can you go in speaking truth to power. Yes, unfortunately, I don't have good news from the UK, so where I live. But yes, I think this is a wider topic, because in theory, if you have, like, one of the things I like about this method is that it creates a lot of things for you to say when there is uncertainty. So instead of saying like, I don't know exactly what theory is true, it could be this or can be that. So it's not a very satisfactory thing to say, because it almost sounds like you haven't done any work. It's like, it almost sounds like you haven't even tried. While, with this method, you can say, we have gone through all this like protocols. We have assessed all these pieces of evidence, and at the end, we get barely more confident than not, or we get 0.65. So, it's kind of a little bit easier, I guess, for an evaluator to argue for ambiguity and uncertainty when you can sort of prove that you've gone through all this process. I don't know if this is just me feeling like this, or maybe, someone can identify themselves in what I'm saying. But I would say that in terms of, if you can demonstrate that you've gone through the rigorous process and then at the end you have uncertainty, it's much better to say, I don't know, straw in the wind, or I don't know, there could be 3 or 4 theories that maybe are equally likely. But, if you actually associate explicit levels of confidence to these theories, and you explain in great detail the lengths that you went through to achieve the sort of precise uncertainty, if you want, I think it's kind of more, you feel a bit more defended in a way, as a consultant, as an evaluator.
It raises the issue of a dialogue with power, and you referred to speaking truth to power, and I think the book we last wrote together was about speaking justice to power, which is very difficult in its own right, and we might have upcoming speaking uncertainty to power. Anyway, thank you very much for this, Barbara, and thank you, Gustav, for being here and asking challenging questions. Barbara, particularly for responding to them. And I think we have come to the end of this Friday afternoon methodological seminar, and let me just say that we have 2 upcoming EBA seminars in the near future. One is on electoral processes, the experiences from electoral assistance, what you do in terms of institutional building, etc. And the other one is, well, and that is evaluative in its nature. And then we have another, which is actually a study, which deals with values and attitudes in the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights in the partner countries in Africa, SIDA's partner countries in Africa. So very welcome to those seminars. There will be dates, etc., on the EBA's website when that is clear. And thank you very much for today.
Everyone.